The events of the Kokoda track campaign are a cornerstone of Australian military history, and some would say national identity. To stand at this memorial is to recognise the men and women who gave their lives in protection of our country, most of whom were younger than myself. But today isn't about them, nor their sacrifice. Today we're talking about film. More specifically, the 2006 film that depicted this famous period, Kokoda. 2006's Kokoda is a case study in how well-intentioned film can, through neglect, have awful implications. It's also propaganda. That isn't the shocking accusation that it sounds like. It can't really help itself. It is depicting propaganda, therefore by extension it too is propaganda. The film is an Australian production with little intent more than to create a patriotic action movie that depicts the fallen Australian soldiers of the period as war heroes. The intention is wholesome enough on its own, but in the end only the audience remains, and the intent of the filmmakers is not what ends up on screen. This is not what you or I would refer to as a historically accurate depiction of the Kokoda campaign. It is full of adaptational changes. And that in itself isn't a problem. There's no hard and fast rule that says that all war films must be documentaries. No one is confused when Inglourious Bastards or Wolfenstein create ridiculous and wonderful ways to kill Hitler. These productions are outlandish to begin with. So by the time we get to the ridiculous stuff, the audience is pretty clued in to what they're experiencing. However, problems arise when historical accuracy and adaptational changes become indistinguishable. The film's opening narration details the film's chronology in pretty much the same language as all war films.
Australia is open to invasion. The Americans, their fleet at the bottom of Pearl Harbor and their eyes turned toward the Philippines, are in no position to help. 10,000 Japanese make their way up the narrow trail from Kokoda toward us. We are alone.
There's nothing that in that narration that indicates that what you just heard was peppered with, we'll call it mistruth, or adaptational changes, you can take your pick. The US were involved in the Kokoda campaign. The Japanese numbers were all over the place, and by the end, the Allied forces had deployed over twice the amount of soldiers as Japan. And probably most importantly, Australia was not under risk of invasion by the Japanese, and I believe that was pretty known even at the time. And all of this is meaningless to the actual plot anyway. It's just a backdrop to the characters that we actually follow. Whether or not the US is involved in the conflict or not doesn't actually affect the individuals that we follow. It's only there to position Australia as somehow more vulnerable, because big boy US isn't actually involved. And that's just the opening narration. These things run all the way through. So by the end of the movie, you are completely misaligned with what actually happened. This is what we're going to refer to as the Fargo effect. You may remember the Coen Brothers movie Fargo. It's a crime drama that opens with a title card, suggesting that everything in the film is 100% true. And within the context of reality, the plot is absolutely batshit crazy, right? And it's a really hard pill to swallow that it's actually true. And of course it's not true, as you find out quite crushingly. And there's a reason why they chose to depict it as such, to put that card at the front and to lie to their audience. Joel Cohen expanded on this in a 2005 interview to shed some light as to why the decision was made. It gives you permission to do things that they might not otherwise accept. To expand on this, we engage with true stories in a very different way to how we engage with fictional texts. You know, like imagine making a murderer, right? If that were a fake, if that was a script, if that was a completely original concept, it would be considered pretty dull by the standards of television as drama. Part of what made it so compelling and such a seminal piece of television was that it was too outrageous to be real, and yet was. So by positioning itself in a historical context, through omission and obfuscation, Kokoda is able to indulge in the benefits of depicting true events while having the luxury of presenting itself in a means convenient for it. In short, it uses the Fargo effect. The area where Kokoda descends an absolute farce is the depiction of the Japanese forces. I could sit here all bloody day and talk about this, but we're running out of sunlight, so we're going to have to keep it brief. The language of the film constantly reinforces the superiority of the Japanese over the Australians. Right out of the gates, the very second line is this.
The relentless Japanese war machine rolls down through Southeast Asia like a deadly virus.
Relentless machine, deadly virus. These words are dehumanizing. You know, the Japanese forces, they don't get cold or hungry or sick. Not like us. They're mechanical, they're like robots. The visual design of the Japanese soldiers is perhaps the most explicit of the objectification. We never, ever, ever see a Japanese soldier's face. They are always silhouettes, out of focus, both. Whenever they do get to close-ups, it's almost always boots. The Australians are always finding ways to be on the ground, giving us symbolic levels. And it's really student film level stuff. It's very, very hit you over the head, and it sucks. The actions of the Japanese are no better, of course. While the Australians are laid low by this horrible environment, the Japanese are depicted as just having conquered it. You know, they have ninjas prowling around in ghillie suits like the fucking Predator, just jumping on dudes. I think we even get a shot with Predator vision. So while they've conquered land, while they cut straight through, they stand out. They also get the benefit of being depicted as being a part of the land as well. They have it both ways. It's very, very bizarre. You know, at one point, a Japanese dude pulls out his ceremonial katana and decapitates a dude, which just adds a whole new array of problems to this soup we're cooking up. It's really, really bad. The Japanese troops in Kokoda are cruel beyond reason, and they are always the aggressors. Any cruelty shown by the Australians, any retaliation, is inherently justified because of the acts of the Japanese. This is an attempt to overlook and forgive the very real acts of torture and cruelty done by the Australians to Japanese soldiers during the war. So the Japanese, right, they're these ninjas at this point. They have done ridiculous things throughout the course of the movie. And the movie ends with these ninjas, these goddamn supernatural ninjas, just like charging at a fortified hill like a fucking Zerg rush. And they get mowed down after 70 minutes of conditioning to think these people are indestructible. It's whiplash. It is so surreal. And I think the other reason it exists is because there's no other way to do a U-turn that large on how superior the soldiers are depicted. It is just weird. It's really weird. So the Japanese are cartoons. By the end of the movie, they're more monsters than combatants. When you strip away the set dressing and the context, really it plays out more like an Aliens movie than it does any recognizable war film. These concepts are the tools of propaganda. Yet rather than depicting the Japanese as lowly and the Australians as superior, it's the opposite. The Japanese are supernaturally better to an insane extent. So the key question is why? Why are the roles reversed? In Australia, our military history is defined not by glory or even victory. Our most famous campaigns are the Gallipoli campaign and the Kokoda campaign, both of which are defined by incompetence from high command. The Gallipoli campaign, quite famously, is the campaign where Australian forces, Anzac forces, landed on the wrong beach. And Kokoda, Wikipedia describes it as a crisis of command that followed due to the leadership failings at the time. The narratives of these battles are not victory or glory, but endurance and perseverance. They celebrate the loyal soldier who doesn't question high command, who fights the good fight, the person who gets on with the job no matter what. So let me speculate for a moment. Let's say that you're the commander of a conflict that's just gotten a great many people killed due to your questionable decisions. Do you own those mistakes, or do you perhaps make martyrs of the dead? Perhaps present them in terms that are agreeable? Perhaps the lesson is that as long as you're capable of possessing your national spirit, of doing whatever you're told and enduring through no matter what, you can accomplish anything. You can accomplish anything. Perhaps defeating even the most relentless of war machine. It's just a thought. So let's talk about Kokoda, the narrative, the myth. Not the men and women who actually died, but how we've chosen to remember them. Kokoda, the myth, requires fragile, empathetic individuals being placed in horrendous circumstances, probably the most we can imagine, and bound by a sense of honor, prevailing against all odds. In that sense, the myth of Kokoda doesn't survive the application of facts. For it to function as a narrative, an antagonist is required so superior to the protagonist to provide that level of oppression. This is why the Japanese are indomitable in the 2006 adaptation. To depict the events of Kokoda as our national identity chooses to remember them, we must omit uncomfortable truths. We must forget that the Japanese were also trapped in a foreign land, cold, sick and hungry. We must overlook incidents of torture and pillaging committed by Australian forces. We have to tell ourselves that it was worth the cost. If you adapt the events of the Kokoda track campaign and you choose not to have resilient Australian soldiers versus oppressive Japanese forces, have you truly adapted Kokoda? This is why the 2006 film makes the decisions that it does. It peddles a fictitious version of events that tells the story not of the men and women who fought in World War II, but how we choose to remember them. And it allows us to take that as truth. This is why Kokoda is propaganda. And I believe that the men and women depicted in this memorial deserve a better movie. Thank you for your time.